Hey guys, welcome to class for Friday, September 11th. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the assignment sheet and specifically some of the formatting requirements for it, as well as some help on how to move forward with writing your introduction and outlining this and starting on your rough draft. Okay, so we're going to start with the assignment sheet. You see that here in your screen. So here under the formatting, the paper format part, this is at the bottom of the first page of the assignment sheet. It says your final draft will need to be in MLA format with proper in-text citations and a works cited page with proper works cited citations. The paper will be a minimum of 3 pages, double-spaced. For help with formatting, see our RetLab module using sources, which you guys should be working on this week, and feel free to access resources to help you build citations, such as Al Excelsior, and it provides you with a link to Al Excelsior. So I'm going to show you a few things. Let's go to Al Excelsior first. So here is what that looks like. When you go to the link, you'll probably go to this page, which is sort of the basics for MLA formatting. And essentially, just understand that MLA stands for Modern Language Association, but there are many different citation styles that are used. For some of your classes, you'll be asked to use APA style, which is another really popular style in academia. That style you can also find over here in Al Excelsior and MLA, as well as a few other style guides. It's important to be able to follow a style guide and to know what the proper documentation process is for any academic work that you're doing. So for our class, we use MLA, and it's important to just honor some of that, the rules and formatting of MLA. It shows you especially that when you're writing for an academic audience with a certain expectation, that you're able to meet those expectations. So here you'll find under this toolbar here, how to do MLA in-text citations, not just how to do them, but why we do them. It gives you information too on how to cite, say that your source has one author or 2 authors or 3 or more authors. Maybe you have 2 sources at some time at one point by the same author. How would you cite those? How do you cite when your source doesn't have page numbers, which you guys are working with a book and an ebook that has page numbers, but your second source might be a podcast, for instance, and it may not have a page number. So how would you cite there? Even things like citing indirect sources, which is where you might cite someone who is cited within the source you're looking at. So there's a number of tutorials here, and I'm going to let you guys look through those for yourself because everyone's working with different sources, and you need to kind of figure out based on what your source looks like, what's best for you. There's also information about a works cited page, where that comes in a paper, how it should be formatted, and also some information on how to cite certain sources. So ebooks. Here's an example. Most of you are going to be citing Dr. Mona Hanna-Atish's book from the e-version that you all have access to. And so this can talk to you about how to do that. Your second source, say it's an online magazine article. You might need to go to online magazine articles here to see, okay, how would I cite that kind of source? And you would just follow this style guide for that. And sometimes, a source that you have may not be as easy to identify as this list. If you ever have a question like that, you're welcome to email me. And sometimes if it's like, I might even say, hey, just cite it as a web page, right? If we're having trouble figuring out what the best way to cite the source is. So down here, there's also this MLA style demo. I'm not going to play these videos for you, but I think they're super helpful in helping you to understand. Like here, this first one's just on MLA style sort of as a whole. And then the second one is what in-text citations are, how they should look, and why we use them. And the third is looking at how you format a works cited page. So let's listen. We will watch a little bit of this third one just as a review for some of you who maybe didn't do too much research writing in your high school classes. So let's watch.
This short video will provide you with the basic information for formatting your works cited page. Before we look at an example list and entry, here are some things to remember about your works cited list. No source should appear on your works cited list that is not cited in your paper with an in-text citation. Your teacher may offer the option of a works consulted page, but cited means you cited that source in your text.
All right, I'm going to stop real quick and just follow up with this. This is so important. I'm sorry if you hear my dog in the background. A lot of students will cite anything that they even referenced at all when they were trying to put their thoughts together for a paper. We are not doing that. You should not, for this class, cite any source that you didn't directly reference in your paper. Okay, so you should, if you had an in-text citation in your paper, you should have a works cited citation at the end of your paper for that source. The other thing is, for this paper, you're really only using 2 sources. But say that you want to use an epigraph for an introductory technique, and you end up researching an outside quote. A lot of students will say, well, that outside quote, should I cite that? Yes. If you're putting it in your paper, you need to cite that outside quote. So wherever you got that quote from. All right, let's keep watching.
Your sources should be listed in alphabetical order by the first word of each entry. The 8th edition of the MLA Handbook provides a system of containers for presenting each source on your works cited list. Because each source type has different kinds of publication information, each source will be formatted a little differently. The MLA resources in the OWL provide models for each source type to help you follow MLA's new container system. Be sure to refer to those resources as you format each source. Let's take a look at one example from a works cited list to get an idea about how entries should be formatted.
All right, before we move on, so they talk about going in and looking at the things I just showed you. You find what kind of source that you're using, and then you use that sample citation to craft your own. A lot of students use citation generators, so things like EasyBib. I'm not going to say that that's the most terrible idea ever, because it's not necessarily. What I will say is that sometimes if you're using EasyBib, like you're using just a URL to pull back information on EasyBib, a lot of times it does not pull back the accurate information. So when in doubt, I wouldn't use a citation generator, because it is so easy for you to just pop in, look and see, okay, how do I cite a book with 3 authors, right? And then just use that sample or that little model citation to write your own. Then you don't have to worry about, whether or not EasyBib pulled everything back and all of that stuff. All right, so let's watch this video for a little more about how, once you have your 2 or 3 citations for this paper, how they should be formatted.
The first entry on this works cited list is a journal article found within a database. There are specific publication elements of journal articles from databases that you should provide. You will first provide the original publication information in the first container. This includes the author, the title of the article, the title of the journal, the volume number, the issue number, and the date. If your source has page numbers, the page numbers should be placed after the date. Because this source has no page numbers, after that information is provided, the second container information is provided. In this case, the database is the second container, for the source provides information about how the source was accessed. It was accessed through a database called JSTOR, so that information is provided. Because each source type includes specific information unique to that source type, once you become more familiar with MLA style, you can recognize a source type just by looking at the works cited list. Here you can see that a journal article accessed from a database looks very different from a book. Remember that your works cited entries should always be double-spaced. You should use the hanging indent to indent any lines after the first line in each entry. This sample works cited should get you started, and the MLA works cited resource here in the OWL can help you format each of your works cited entries using the new MLA container system.
Okay.
This
So
short video will
hopefully this helps show you just at least some of the resources that are available to you through the online learning lab or online writing lab. You also have RetLab to help, so the using sources module can be very helpful as well. So there are also other things like going through little quizzes and activities that are housed here within AlExcelsior. So I encourage you guys to use these as you start to figure out, okay, how exactly am I supposed to cite this kind of source? Try to find it for yourself, and then for sure reach out to me or Miss Black. We deal with, how do you deal with these sources all the time, and we'll try to help you out as well. Okay, so I'm going to show you a sample paper from a student from last year. And this student, so this paper is not on What the Eyes Don't See, because that was not their common read. Their common read was a book titled Evicted, which was about housing discrimination and poverty in the U.S. And what I want to show you, I'm going to show you some MLA specs, but I'm also going to talk to you about, the critical thinking project. This is a synthesis essay that's showing me that you took this common read and you're thinking critically about it and putting it in conversation with another text. So I'll talk about some specs, and then I will actually look at portions of this essay so I can show you guys some things that this student did really well and some things that this student would maybe should have revised before she submitted it, or some things she might have wanted to edit out, things like that. So in MLA, what you'll notice here is a standard heading in MLA will have your name, and I've marked hers off here for her privacy, but it'll have your name, and then it'll have my name. It'll have Writing 101 and the date of submission, so the date that this is due. Then you will have the title of your essay, okay? And that title is going to be based on what your paper is about, okay? You just want to make sure that the title is specific to what your paper is about and not something like synthesis title or essay. I'll have that sometimes. So I'll often tell students, think about, if I ask you the question, hey, what's your paper about? Your answer to that is often the title. So if I were asking her, what is your paper about? She might say, oh, it's about the effects of discrimination on poverty in America, okay? Up here in MLA, your header box, you're supposed to have your last name and the page number listed in the header box. You guys can try to do that. It's really dependent on the template you're using. If you're using Google Docs, a lot of times you don't get the header function. If you're in Word document, you should be able to get the header function. So you guys just, if you don't end up putting the header in, that's not the worst thing in the world. It is an MLA spec, but it's not, it'll be fine if your formatting doesn't allow it, okay? Notice too that the entire document is in Times New Roman font. Okay, that's very important, and I can tell, I've read enough papers that I can tell if you failed to be able to shift that font over to Times New Roman. What I would do is, as soon as you have your Word document up or whatever you're working with, go ahead and change the entirety of that document to Times New Roman, and then you won't have to worry about it again. Notice too that paragraphs are indented. And that the entire document is double spaced, and there is not extra space between paragraphs. So that first paragraph ends and the second paragraph begins, and there is no extra space. There's simply an indentation to suggest there's a new paragraph, okay? One place where the student went wrong here is she's putting a lot of extra space between the heading, the title, and then the title and the body. Again, all of this should be double spaced, so there shouldn't be this extra space there. So she should kind of boost that back up. As we go through, you see she's still has this formatted header with the page numbers here on the top right of the document. And then here is her works cited page. So at the end of your document, not in a separate document, sometimes students will do the works cited page on a separate document and try to upload too. At the very end of your paper, you will have the works cited page. Notice how works cited is spelled, works. So these are the works cited. Sometimes students will put work cited. That would be fine if you only have one source, but if you have more than one source, it should be works. Cited, C-I-T-E-D. I have students often misspell works cited. Notice it's centered. The works cited heading is not bolded, it's not underlined, it's not bigger than anything else. It's all standard to the rest of the paper. Notice too, she has 3 sources listed. The reason for that is this first one she uses as an epigraph for this paper. Okay, the 2 sources she's actually synthesizing are the Desmond book, which was their common read, and then this second source. And you'll notice that Desmond is actually a co-author of the second source. Okay, notice a couple things. These citations are listed in alphabetical order by the first word of the citation. Sometimes students get nervous and think, oh, the first word of my citation is not an author's last name, so maybe it goes at the end. It doesn't matter if it's the start of a title or if it's an author's last name. Whatever that first word is, that's the order those citations will go in. Notice too, there's a hanging indent format on these citations. So to do that, there are a couple ways. In Word, you can actually highlight and choose format hanging indent, and it'll do it for you. Or you can do it yourself by coming to the end of your line, hitting enter, end of your first line of your citation, hitting enter or return, and then tabbing over. And you should be able to indent your own citations there. Okay. Notice her paper was 4 pages. This is a 3-page minimum paper. More than likely you will go over that 3 pages, okay? But there's a 3-page minimum, and that does not include the works cited page. So it should be at least 4 pages long in total, 3 pages of writing with the 4th page being your works cited page. You're welcome to go over that, but you can't go under that 3 pages. Okay. Let's talk about a few things. We in our Wednesday session this week, we discussed introductions and how an introduction always starts with a hook, so that engages the reader, and then it provides information, identifying information about both of the sources that are going to be explored in the paper, and then it provides a claim, and the claim is making connections between these 2 sources and sort of setting up what you want to say about those. So we're going to look at her paper. She starts with this quote, okay? And she says it's, I'll just read it for you. In a national poll of nearly 2,000 Americans, 48% of respondents indicated that they believe the biggest cause of poverty today is that people are not doing enough to help themselves, okay? Notice she said, she starts with this assumption, right? That the reason people are poor is because they're just not working hard enough. They're not trying to help themselves. She says that she got this from Population Reference Bureau, which if you scroll down to her works cited page, what I should see there is the very first word should be Population Reference Bureau, but it isn't. The first word is American Attitudes About Poverty and the Poor, okay? So you want to make sure this student did not do her citation correctly. If she's going to quote from this source, then what goes in her in-text citation should be American Attitudes About Poverty and the Poor, or she could even shorten it and just say, quote, American Attitudes, okay? So in other words, whatever you cite in text should line up with the first word or words of your works cited citation. Okay. The student starts with this assumption about, 48% of respondents believe this about poverty. And then she counters it. It's kind of an interesting way to start. She says, what many of the respondents who felt this way may not realize is that discrimination plays a crucial role in one's likelihood of becoming trapped in poverty. So this is her kind of saying, almost half of these respondents say this, but they may not realize that discrimination actually plays a role in poverty and that it's not just about someone's individual effort. Okay, interesting way to start. I'm a fan of the hook. Then notice she does exactly what we've all talked about doing. She's going to introduce both sources. Okay, so she says Matthew Desmond, Pulitzer Prize winning author of Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City, lived alongside people in poverty who were constantly facing evictions in order to better understand the causes behind their financial and housing situations. Okay, so if we think about how she's building Desmond's ethos, his credibility here, she says he's a Pulitzer Prize winning author. He's written this book, and he did not just do this research, but he actually, in his research, lived alongside people in poverty and wrote about those experiences. So he lived it firsthand. This is a good job of building credibility here. One thing, do you notice that she does not punctuate her titles there? So remember, book titles should be italicized and articles should be in quotation marks. She goes on to describe the second source. She says Desmond then went on to co-author the insightful Harvard study, Discrimination in Evictions, Empirical Evidence and Legal Challenges with Dina Greenberg and Carl Gershenson. Okay, so she's saying here's the second source. It's a study. He co-authored this study with these other people. Now, she doesn't tell us who these other people are necessarily, but she's introducing this second source. The second source is a study, whereas the first source is this book. Okay. Notice she also doesn't punctuate the title of that study. So that's really important to do, is to punctuate appropriately. And now look, I've highlighted her claim. She says both sources explore the hard truths about how discrimination based on race and sex affects those in poverty and challenge many Americans' preconceived notions about the circumstances that have trapped so many people in a place of financial instability. So her piece is going to explore how Desmond in both of these works is looking at and arguing that racial and gender-based discrimination has a big role to play in poverty levels in the US today. Okay. All right, this is a strong introduction. She's hooking us. She's clearly articulating the source material she's going to use. There are some editing problems, right? But she does the job here, and she provides a claim where she's connecting these sources. So we know what's coming now. She's going to be looking at how these sources are conveying this information about race and gender discrimination. So as she goes through, what you'll be able to tell, and I'm going to go back to the assignment sheet, particularly part 5. So when you're thinking about starting to draft your critical thinking project, now remember first, your introduction is due Monday. So you want to bring it in its entirety, hook, introducing your sources, and the claim. We're going to do a little writer's workshop with it. But we'll also do peer review next Wednesday. And so you want to go ahead and start working on your rough draft. Here in part 5, it gives you some advice on organizational structure. So organization 1 has your intro and your claim. And then you look at the sections of the paper, like what source 1 kind of says about this commonality, what source 2 says about it. And then notice it says, how do the sources differ, challenge one another, or expand on one another? Okay, so it's not just about talking about what they have to say that's similar. It's also, how does one work, maybe take it a step further, expand on this idea, or even challenge a section of this idea of the first source. And then finally, you end with your conclusion, and your conclusion is, what do we do with this now, right? Like, why does this matter? Why is this ultimately important to be talking about these issues at all right now? So you want to think about that as a possible organizational structure. Or what you may do is think about the commonalities. So say there are 2 traits. This student's looking at race and gender discrimination. So what she might do is structure it around, okay, race discrimination, this is what source 1 and source 2 say. Gender discrimination, this is what source 1 and source 2 say. and then move on from there. Okay, so it's really up to your notes and those commonalities you were able to find in the dialogue journal I had you do this weekend, and that will help you kind of structure out where you want to go with the paper. All right, if we go back to her paper, she's going to be looking mostly source one, source two, and then a combination of the two. So here she's giving us information about Desmond's book, and what it says specifically about race, and also that this is ultimately an American story. You know, the book is set in Milwaukee, but it tells an American story, which makes me think a lot about the Dr. Mona's What the Eyes Don't See, because it's a story about Flint, but it's also a story about America, right? Then notice she shifts into her second source and she says Greenberg and her team. Notice Desmond is a part of Greenberg's team. He's one of the co-authors here, but because she's the first one in the article listed, this student will be referencing Greenberg or Greenberg and her team often. So she kind of looks also at the Harvard study and the some of the results, particularly looking at racial discrimination in these communities. And then toward the end, she starts to put these sources in conversation with one another. And this is where that synthesis really comes through. She says, while discrimination and evictions, so that's an article, again, punctuation is important. She says, while that supports the claims made in Evicted, Greenberg proposes reasons other than discrimination that may explain why minority groups are facing higher eviction rates. One of these possible reasons is language barriers. Spanish-speaking tenants may not be able to discuss late payments with their landlords or understand their eviction notices and court orders. So she starts to talk about how one source does talk about race and gender discrimination, but it pushes further and says there could be these other issues like language barriers with some folks. Also, access to legal aid is limited for some of these folks. So if they can't access a lawyer or representation, you know, are they going to be able to fight that eviction in the same way? And so some of that steps away from race and gender, you know, into these other facets of poverty that are affecting a lot of these evictions. Finally, your conclusion is pushing into the larger conversation as a whole, right? So why does any of this matter? This is how this student decided to close out her paper. She says, Matthew Desmond's Evicted and Greenberg's Discrimination in Evictions challenge the generally held belief by American people that those in poverty have the power to help themselves and are simply choosing to do nothing about their situation. So guys, notice that goes directly back to her first line where she said a lot of people have an assumption that folks in poverty are there by choice and that they're just choosing to be lazy and not help themselves. She's saying these sources really challenge that assumption, right? And she goes on to say a large underlying cause behind people's evictions are their race and or gender, something they have no control over. If the American public were made aware of the true causes behind many people's financial and housing situations, perhaps they would be more willing to make efforts to change the system that does little to help those in poverty find a way out. Okay, so this is a good conclusion. I wouldn't call it a super strong one. I think that she could call for more research into some of this. She could call for more leadership to talk about these things publicly, for more activism based on housing and housing discrimination and evictions and poverty. I mean, I think she could maybe even talk about an organization, maybe even Matthew Desmond's work that is seeking to provide supports, right? So that we see less people evicted in this country. There are a lot of things she could have done here to really push this out in the conclusion, why this matters and what we need to do, almost like a call to action. And she's just not doing it here, but it's not a terrible conclusion either. She's summing it up. She's referencing back to her introduction. That's always a nice way to conclude. She's not repeating the exact same line she was saying earlier. You know, she's offering us new insights. So there's something to be said for that. But conclusions can always be pushed forward, because remember, that's the thing that you leave the reader with. So I hope that this helped to kind of look at this student sample. I'm not going to post it because sometimes when you post a student sample, folks tend to want to model way too closely from it. Instead, there are a couple in-text citation things I'll point out. Notice when she references, when she's quoting from her second source, her in-text citations are Greenberg et al. That is what you generally use if you have 3 or more authors when you cite. So Greenberg is the first one listed, but notice there are 3, including Matthew Desmond. But when you cite them in text, instead of having to put Greenberg, Gershenson, and Desmond, you can just put Greenberg et al. And then the page number there. Notice too, when she cites from our book, it's pretty straightforward. Desmond, who is the author of the book, and the page number. Notice the misspelling there. There are a number, for how strong this paper is, there are a number of like smaller editing errors. That's just to be expected. We all make those kinds of mistakes, but this is why, especially toward the end of a paper, you want to really go through it, read it aloud. A lot of times reading your work aloud helps you find those problems. And maybe if you're just not great with grammar, have someone, a friend or a parent or a teacher from back home, you know, who is really good at grammar, have them go over it and edit it and give you some notes and some tips. Okay. I think that's all I have for today. I know this was a longer video. I hope you found it helpful. Remember, as we get to Monday, by the end of the day today, you need to finish the Using Sources RetLab module, so make sure you do that. There is a daily write today to mean the day, so make sure you go in and do your daily write. This weekend, you're working on that introduction. You want to have that introduction ready to share with the class on Monday, and just go ahead and start working on that rough draft, because we will be ready for our first peer review next Wednesday. Email me if you have any questions. I hope y'all have a great rest of your Friday, and I will see you soon.